Good evening. Thank you for joining me this evening for something a little bit unusual for this channel. We're the boys from the Baltic Star, and we generally play narrative games like tabletop RPGs. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, things tend to get a bit more complicated with family and events, so tonight I'm on my own for our usual Friday session where we'd normally be playing Traveller. So, first of all, tomorrow we're going to be finishing off the latest Cecil and Cecily adventure with the wonderful Sock Fiddler as our guest, which is a game set in Jacobean England and filled with strange accents and local colour. Sorry, cultists, local cultists. And in January, we're doing a special month of one shot games, which we call our Winter of Love. If you fancy playing in any of those games, there are slots available to play in them, so please check our Discord, where we have details of how you can join in on a live streamed RPG that's guaranteed to last exactly 2 hours to the second. But tonight, let's get on with tonight. Well, tonight I'm going to tell you a story. So there's a story behind the story, if you will. If you enjoy tabletop RPGs, then I have to tell you about another channel that has been one of our great joys for many years. Infinite Monkey Tales, as they're called, play a huge variety of RPGs from Call of Cthulhu to Star Wars and everything in between, which is quite a lot of between if you think about it. They've been so enthusiastic in promoting new games, new designers, new ideas, and they've been an amazing supporter of the Boys from the Baltic Star. You see, they often stream on the same nights as us, but earlier, so we often get to be the beneficiaries of their raids. Um, they're such a great group of people and wonderful advert for the sheer breadth of games that fall within the RPG genre and hobby. Tonight, though, I need to mention one of the monkeys in particular. So, Angie Pops is one of the IMT crew, and she's been an unfailing supporter of our channel as well. It's such a pleasure whenever she jumps into our stream. And a while ago, Angie Pops asked me to read her a story, a Christmas story, ideally. Obviously, I have no problem with that, and we literally have a channel here where I can stream anything that appeals to me, so that's convenient. Only, and this is the thing, in my more delusional moments, I sometimes have enough arrogance to think of myself as a writer. So, despite the enormous array of brilliant short stories that are absolute classics and are far beyond the iron grip of copyright, I decided to write new story for tonight. So, as you listen to this, live or on VOD, keep telling yourself that I could have chosen a story by Tolstoy or Conan Doyle or Poe, and I rejected all of that so I could inflict my writing upon you. I'm sorry. Now, there's one more thing you need to know before we begin. This isn't a horror story, but it also isn't a tale of Christmas trees and joyful celebration. My personal taste in narrative leans towards the darker shades, and I'm a huge fan of horror films. My favourite Christmas movie is Better Watch Out. So I suppose it's time to stop stalling and get on with it. I'm going to be reading this story live, so I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to check or interact with chat while I'm doing that, but I will check comments at the end, of course, if there are any. The story is called 6 Minutes to Midnight, and I hope you enjoy it. If not, then I do have a standard complaints procedure. If you write your complaint in pencil on a £20 note and send it to me, then I will carefully consider what you said. Thank you, Angie Pops, for the idea, and I suppose this is my Christmas present to you. So, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. 6 minutes to midnight. The clock stood at 11, deep in the evening, as George Parker sat wearily down. He'd only just sat when he remembered that the whisky and glasses were across the room. He groaned to himself and stood, hearing the slight crackle from his joints. It had been a long day. He poured himself a small drink, then with a slight smile poured more into the glass. He carried the glass and bottle back to his chair and put them on the little table as he sat. He took a sip, another, a third. Christmas Eve. He sat back, cradling the glass in his lap and closing his eyes. Half the world was already technically done with the eve and on to the day, though many of those would be asleep for hours yet. Also, he reminded himself, not everyone celebrated Christmas. Plenty of places didn't have much use for it. Even here in England, there were people who just gave it a cursory nod as they passed. George was too old to think of Christmas as a time for presents, and too alone to think of it as a time for family. For him, Christmas had come to mean two things: food and television. Now it was just food, as the internet and its perpetual streaming services had robbed the season of the great joy that was the Radio Times double issue. He could remember sitting with his brother, circling all the things they wanted to watch across the school holiday, the movies and the seasonal specials. Those days were gone. The boys had been inseparable as children and close as adults. Then Phil's daughter married an Aussie and moved to Brisbane. After Phil lost his wife, he went there to join them. Modern technology's great. George could call his brother whenever he wanted, and he knew Phil would always be happy to get the call. He could call at any time. But he didn't. Phil had grandchildren now, a new life. No matter how friendly their interactions, George just didn't feel a part of it. A few years ago, Phil even suggested George move to Brisbane as well, as he didn't have any other family. George told him he was happy where he was, but hid the real reason. A conviction following a drunken fight in a pub made him an undesirable for the Australian government. Ironic. A couple of centuries earlier, that conviction would have earned him a free trip over there. What he could do with, he thought for the 1000th time, is a cat. In his mind there was some ideal version of a cat, one that would run to him when he came home, curl up in his lap, be warm, furry, and companionable. They'd had a cat called Tom when he was a boy. He remembered the little thing very fondly. It hid from everyone unless it was hungry, and scratched anyone who tried to cuddle it. If you got too close when it was eating, then it hissed and would bite if you were in its way. He loved that cat. He was looking forward to Christmas Day. The community centre did a lunch for people like him, people with nowhere else to go. He didn't need to rely on others for food in general, but at Christmas he went down to the hall and sat at a table with other old and lonely people for a turkey dinner. The food wasn't special. He would probably have done better making a turkey sandwich with toast, if truth be told, and the old people were trying their best, but it was hard to make a connection with them. He still thought of them as the older generation. They talked about the 50s and Korea, about rationing and Butlins. George was only 10 years younger in reality, but his youth had been the Rolling Stones, Northern Ireland, Watergate. There was, however, a reason for attending. The people who made the food, put out the crackers. They sacrificed some of their Christmas Day for him, and he appreciated it. They were kind and friendly, of course, but even that wasn't really the reason. For most of those volunteers, it was part of their own tradition. They chose to have their family meal in the evening or the day before, and they came to look after George, along with their families. And that was the key. Christmas Day with the older generation and the painfully sympathetic was a great kindness, but tinged with depression. But when they brought their children, that was so very different. For an old man, there was nothing that could bring a smile like the sound of a laughing child. He had carefully memorized half a dozen jokes he could tell them, and he knew they would laugh. He would put up with a woman 40 years younger than him telling him how well he looked, even though standing up was now an activity that required forward planning. He would smile at her, thank her, and watch her skip through the room as if it was a dance floor. Not envious at all. Not as long as he could hear her children laugh. He closed his eyes for a few minutes, starting himself awake as he almost lost his grip on the glass. He stared at it. It had very nearly fallen from his sleepy fingers. He rested it back on the table, poured another generous measure. He looked around the gloomy room, trying to imagine what each corner would look like if it had a cat curled up in it. He glanced at the old clock on the wall. It stood at 10 to midnight. It kept excellent time, barely ever lost or gained a second. When he'd last set it, because of the return to mean time, he'd aimed for roughly the right position of the hands, and he wasn't far off, given his very limited enthusiasm for precision. It was almost exactly 6 minutes slow, and would remain so until the spring, when he'd make another approximation at the time and live with that guess for half a year. All of that meant that Christmas Day was just a few minutes away. He nodded to himself. He drained his glass, then poured another generous measure of the cheap brandy. He could have afforded better brandy if it had really been important to him, but he'd become accustomed to the sort that was simply labelled brandy. He left the glass where it was, staring at the clock. This brandy was special, despite the cheapness. It was his Christmas brandy, so he'd wait for the first sip until the clock showed 6 minutes to midnight. In the quiet room, he could just hear the subtle ticking of the clock. The wind outside had dropped, so the old house was practically silent. He watched the second hand sweep round until, just at the moment it reached the top, he smiled. He reached for the glass, raised it in front of his face as if toasting some imaginary friend across the room, and raised it towards his lips. He stopped, frowning, at an unexpected sound. Someone was at the door, perhaps. He listened, his glass held steady near his chin. Maybe he imagined it. No, there it was again, a very subtle sound to be sure, but definitely real. It was the sound of someone or something outside the door. Not knocking, but present somehow, maybe scratching quietly. He made a second attempt at taking his first sip, but no, there it was again, like the slightest of scratches. He had to look. He couldn't keep failing to drink his Christmas brandy. He put the glass down and, groaning slightly, clambered to his feet. He shuffled to the door, listening for any other sounds, but he heard nothing. At the door, he turned the latch and pulled it open. The dark outside was intense. Little of his light spilled out, but his shadow fell out onto the path, solid white with fresh snow. There was nobody there. He closed the door. Maybe it had been a passing animal or something. He turned back towards his chair and his brandy, walking across the room. He hadn't even reached the chair when he heard that noise again. A quiet but distinctive sound, like a scratch. He froze, listened. There it was again. It didn't sound like a light scratch done quickly, more like a slow, deliberate drag across a surface, deep, and made of several noises with very brief pauses. He went back to the door and pulled it open. It was, as before, as if nothing had ever been outside his house. He made a decision. He reached the table by the door where he left his keys and his gloves. He picked up the key ring and dropped it into his pocket, then picked up the torch that he always left there and switched it on. He stepped out of the house onto the gravel path. If there was a person outside, he should have heard their steps on this gravel, surely. His own steps were loud crunches, part snow, part gravel. He shone the torch around, satisfying himself that there was nobody there. He let out a grumpy sound and turned back to the house, but then noticed something that hadn't caught his eye before without the aid of the torch. There were marks at the bottom of his door. He crouched, shining the light at the bottom of the door to see a number of fresh, deep scratches. They were very thin, almost as if they'd been made with something like a knife blade, and they cut through the several layers of paint and into the wood of the door underneath. Confused, he looked round again, shining the torch under the bushes and around the sides of the house. Nothing seemed to be amiss apart from the scratches on the door. And there were no footprints in the snow. Had something flown to this door? He stood up again, holding the door frame to help his aching knees. He stepped inside the house and closed the door, switching off the torch and returning it and his keys to the table inside, just where they always rested. He looked across the room at his chair, well, the back of his chair. It was a large armchair with a high back, and it hid his waiting glass of brandy. Took a deep breath and walked over. He stepped over towards the chair, already imagining the warm taste of the drink, when he heard a sound again. This time it wasn't a scratch, more a soft thump. He stopped, frowned, and turned. In the middle of the floor, sitting calmly and watching him, was a cat. It was a large tabby. It was completely silent, and in its eyes there seemed to be a little recognition, but no fear. He stared at it, uncomprehending, just for a few seconds. The cat stared back. He took a step forwards, and it remained where it was. His knees were opposed to the thought of crouching, but he bent over, resting his hand on the kitchen table that was, technically, in the kitchen, but was a little too big, so this end crossed the imaginary boundary into the living room. He reached out a hand and gently stroked the cat's head. It didn't purr, but it leant into his touch. It felt cold, but he thought it would warm up quickly enough now it was inside. "Good evening," he said formally. "How nice of you to visit. I was just thinking about getting a cat." Obviously he knew this wasn't his cat, not one he could keep, but a friendly visit on Christmas Eve would be very welcome. The visitor had a collar, fabric, slightly fraying, so somebody loved it, or had loved it at some point. The cat let out a low whine. He stroked it again, and then it stood up, arched its back, and walked into the kitchen area. "Hungry, are we?" he smiled, as the cat rubbed its length against the kitchen cupboards. He stepped over and found himself grinning like an idiot as his visitor immediately poured its entire body along his ankle. He opened the cupboard and peered inside. He was right. There was a single small tin of tuna, the type that didn't require draining. The modern world. You didn't have to drain it, didn't even need a tin opener as it came with a ring pull. In a few years you'd probably be able to download it from the computer straight onto your plate. He took a saucer from the draining rack by the sink and used a fork to scoop the tuna onto it and then break up the blocks a bit. Between him and the counter, the cat has reared up onto its hind legs and was stretching, ecstatic, towards the food. He dropped the empty tin into the bin, where it landed on the packaging from his evening meal. He was a perfectly capable cook, always piercing the film lid several times. He put the saucer down and immediately the cat began eating. He kept one arm on the counter and the other hand was stroking the cat's neck. He idly wondered about returning to his chair, but dismissed the thought. He was enjoying the soft fur and sheer vigour of the creature too much. In a minute or two, the animal was finished. He gave it another stroke and picked up the saucer. He hadn't collected enough dirty dishes to make washing up a worthwhile exercise yet. Probably not until Boxing Day. The cat reared up again, stretching for the counter. "Still hungry?" He petted the head again. "No idea if I've got anything else, but I can look." He wasn't optimistic, but it was always possible that there was some forgotten tin of mackerel at the back of the cupboard. He pulled open the door and looked. For just a second he stared as if he couldn't believe his eyes. There was a single tin of tuna there, the kind that didn't require draining, the kind with a ring pull. Automatically, but feeling numb, he opened it and broke the contents up on the saucer, then put it on the floor. This time he ignored the little sounds the cat was making as it ate. He was turning the tin around in his hand. Was his memory really that bad? How did he fail to notice the second tin, right where the first one had been? Perhaps it was hidden behind the first one. He shrugged and threw the empty tin into the bin, where it landed on the packaging from the evening meal. He frowned. There was no other empty tin. One tin, no possible place a second tin could have hidden itself. He stared at the cat for a few seconds. It finished the tuna, then reared up again towards the counter. He picked up the saucer. put it back on the side. A thought occurred to him. The cat had already eaten. In fact, it had eaten lavishly for a small animal. Still, he reached towards the cupboard again. For some reason his hand was shaking slightly, like it was remembering what adrenaline felt like. He slowly opened the door and revealed, to his surprise, and not to his surprise, that there was a tin of tuna there. Just one. The kind you didn't have to drain. The kind with the ring pull. He let the door slam and looked down into the bin. The packaging from the evening meal was there. He could see the film lid that he'd peeled off hours ago, pierced several times. No empty tin of tuna. He stared at the cat. Wild thoughts, impossible thoughts, flew through his mind. Was he imagining the cat? He looked at the collar. There was a small metal tag on it. He steeled himself. The cat had an owner. If it had an owner, then it was real, and the owner was real. He reached for the tag, and the cat nuzzled him as he turned it to the light. Tom, it read, and it had a telephone number. He knew the number. He could have recited it from memory. He had recited it from memory 1,000 times. It was the number they had when he was a boy. He dropped the tag and stared at Tom. He began to see 100 details. The slight discoloration on the left paw, the slightly lopsided profile of the mouth, that patch of fur on the right that never quite grew as thick as the rest. It was Tom. His Tom. The cat purred. It felt like he was being rewarded for finally understanding. He didn't. He didn't understand, he just had another piece of the puzzle. He should have been thrilled to be reunited with his childhood cat, but the thought was frightening. He carefully stepped over to the front door, opened it. Steeling his resolve, he turned to the cat. Tom was sitting on the floor behind him, not doing anything, just staring. Out, he croaked. The cat ignored him. He looked down at the snow. No footprints betrayed how Tom could have approached the house, and there was certainly no window open, not on such a cold night. He stared again at the perfect snow, desperately hoping to see some evidence of a cat's paws. Nothing. Then, as a chill ran up his spine, he realized something else. He'd stepped out into the snow earlier, just a few minutes ago. There were no footprints from him, either. He silently closed the door. He glanced at the clock. It showed 6 minutes to midnight. It was an old clock, but it kept excellent time. Always had. The hand was still sweeping round, but it hadn't changed from when he heard that sound at the door. He had to know. He didn't want to look, but he had to know. He stared at the high back of that great armchair. He could see the edge of the little table, but not the glass that he knew was resting there. Or did he? Did he know anything anymore? Tom lowered his head to the floor, almost as if in sympathy. George took a step towards the chair, then another. Then, too afraid to get closer, a step to the side. From that angle he could see the glass resting on the small table by the chair, still holding his Christmas brandy, the one he'd never managed to sip. Next to it, resting on the table, was a hand. He could only see the back of it and the fingers. He knew it like the back of his hand. He tried to say something, to cry out. Nothing came. For a long time he stared at the horrible sight until, eventually, he felt a tear roll down his cheek. A second later he felt that soft feeling of Tom rubbing round his ankles. He knew of only one thing to do. He bent over and stroked the cat. It purred at him, then, as he watched it, walked over to the door. He stood straight and nodded to nobody in particular, then stepped to the door and pulled it wide open. The snow outside was still perfect, untouched. Force of habit made him glance at his keys on their table by the door, but he sighed and left them where they were. The cat slowly walked outside and George followed, pulling the door closed behind him. He saw in that last sliver of light just before it closed that the foot of the door had no sign of scratches. For a moment the two stood there. Then the cat began to walk off down the path, and George followed, a pace behind. The night was completely silent except, very faintly in the distance, in the direction they were walking, was the sound of children laughing. They walked over the snow, neither of them leaving any trace of their passing. So there you go. I hope that was okay. Sip of wine. Right. Uh, I hope you enjoyed the story. It was at least mercifully short. Um, and uh, and when you see this, Angie Pops, I hope you have a very good Christmas, and I hope you enjoyed it. Tomorrow night, Sock Fiddler is joining us to play the second part of Cecil and Cecily and the Island of Secrets, our madcap Jacobean cultist adventure. And then I don't think we're doing anything over the actual Christmas weekend, but we will be back in January for the Winter of Love. So please, you're joining tomorrow, Sparrow. Is that right? Fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. So, how nice that will be. So, if anyone who catches this on VOD is interested in actually playing a tabletop RPG with us in January, the schedule is now up on our Discord, and we can do a. There are, I think, 6 games up there. Pretty sure it's 6. They are very varied in nature. They are all completely different. They use different rule systems. They all use different settings and times, and they are a completely insane mixture. So please, if you fancy playing a game with us, we're honestly quite friendly and welcoming. Um, then, and these games do last exactly 2 hours. I mean, we literally have a clock running on them, so they aren't going to take up an insane amount of your time, and you're not going to be expected to come back the following week or anything like that. So if you do fancy having a go at some effectively brand new home created RPGs, then please let us know in Discord and we will reserve a seat at the table for you. Until then, I will be back tomorrow night for Cecil and Cecily and the Island of Secrets with apparently not only Socks but also Sparrow. So, thank you very much for joining me this evening or for catching it on VOD. And I will and I will see you when I see you next. So until then, have a very good night. Cheers.